You already know why you're failing, but you keep acting like you don't. That is the most uncomfortable truth you avoid every single day. Because the real problem is not confusion. It is not lack of strategy. It is not missing information. It is the quiet decision to ignore what you already understand when the moment arrives. You know what breaks your progress. You know what delays you. You know what habits are pulling you backward. Yet in real time, you still choose them. Not accidentally. Not unknowingly. But repeatedly. That is where the gap exists, not between knowledge and ignorance, but between knowledge and execution. You wake up with clarity. You tell yourself today will be different. You map the structure in your mind. Focus. Discipline. Control. But then reality enters the system. A small delay in the morning. A distraction that feels harmless. A decision to start a little later. And you already know what happens next. You don't return to the original standard. This is not failure of intelligence. It is failure of enforcement. Picture this moment clearly. You sit down to work. You know exactly what matters most today. But instead of starting, you check something quickly. You already know it is a trap. Yet you still allow it. That single moment silently shifts the entire day. And you feel it, but you continue anyway. That is the part most people never admit. Awareness is not missing, discipline is. This video is not going to teach you what you already know. It is going to expose why knowing has not translated into doing. Because your failure is not built on ignorance, it is built on repeated permission. Permission to delay. Permission to adjust. Permission to break what you already decided. And every time you give that permission, you don't lose knowledge, you lose authority over yourself. By the end of this, you will see exactly how that internal contradiction forms, why it keeps repeating, and what shift is required to finally close the gap between what you know and what you actually do. There are 3 internal mechanisms that explain why you repeatedly fail even though you already know exactly what to do. The first is awareness override. This happens when you clearly understand the right action, but in the moment, you choose differently. Knowledge exists, but it doesn't enforce behavior. It becomes background noise, something you can recite but not act on. Every time you bypass what you already know, you are training yourself to treat awareness as optional. The second is emotional priority bias. In critical decision points, short-term comfort consistently outranks long-term alignment. You are not rejecting discipline, you are postponing it for a feeling that seems harmless at first. That instant gratification, that tiny relief, slowly accumulates. What started as a small concession quietly becomes your default mode of operation. The third mechanism is the self-explanation loop. After compromising your plan, your mind quickly generates reasons that justify the action. I was tired. Today was different. I'll fix it tomorrow. These explanations reduce psychological discomfort but strengthen the behavioral pattern that keeps you stuck. You feel clever, rational, responsible, but you are simply rehearsing the same failure. Consider a grounded example. Someone knows they should focus on deep work for 2 uninterrupted hours. The plan is clear, and the benefit is understood. But when a notification appears, they glance at it just for a moment. 10 minutes pass. The day continues off track. They knew the cost, but still accepted it. That is the anatomy of repeated failure, not ignorance, but permission followed by justification. Another everyday scenario, someone improving health habits. They know diet, timing, and exercise are crucial. Yet after a long day, they choose convenience over plan. Not because they misunderstand, but because comfort feels more urgent than alignment. Each decision reinforces a pattern, slowly reshaping identity from I am disciplined to I try when convenient. Rohn once said, "What is easy to do is also easy not to do." That is the essence of this framework. The right action is always clear, what is inconsistent is enforcement. Understanding these 3 mechanisms is the first step. They make the invisible structure of repeated failure visible. Awareness is not the missing ingredient, control over these internal patterns is. Every failure you feel today can be traced back to one of these mechanisms quietly operating behind the scenes. The reason you keep failing is not that you don't understand discipline, it's that understanding has stopped translating into execution. And that gap, repeated over time, becomes identity. Most people assume failure is a single event. Something goes wrong, and they fall off track. But in reality, failure is usually slow. It is built through dozens of small moments where you already knew what to do, and still didn't do it. That repetition is what reshapes you. At the beginning, there is clarity. You know your priorities. You can even explain your system to others. Everything feels structured in your mind. But the real test is never clarity, it is continuity under ordinary conditions. The moment life becomes normal again, discipline is tested in silence. Let's break what actually happens across this cycle. First stage, clear intention with low resistance. You start strong. You follow the plan. There is alignment between thought and action. At this stage, nothing is challenging yet, so identity feels stable. Second stage, small deviations begin. You don't quit. You adjust. You delay. You reduce intensity slightly. These are not dramatic failures. They feel harmless. But this is where the structure begins to weaken. Third stage, justified inconsistency. Now the mind starts defending behavior. You are no longer just acting differently, you are explaining why it is acceptable. This is where self-awareness becomes dangerous, because it produces reasons instead of correction. A grounded example, someone commits to improving productivity at work. First few days, they follow a strict schedule. Then one day they start late because it doesn't matter today. After that, starting late becomes easier. Within 2 weeks, urgency replaces structure. They are still working, but they are no longer leading their day. They are reacting to it. Another example, fitness discipline. A person understands their routine. They know exactly what to eat, when to train, how to recover. But after fatigue builds, they start modifying the plan. Not stopping completely, just adjusting. These adjustments accumulate until the original system no longer exists. This is where Rohn's principle becomes relevant. Discipline is the bridge between goals and accomplishment. But that bridge is not crossed once, it is crossed daily, in the same direction, without negotiation. Now here's the deeper layer most people miss. You are not failing because you don't know the right action. You are failing because your decision-making process changes under discomfort. When energy is high, you act correctly. When energy drops, you begin to bargain. That shift, moment to moment, is what determines outcome, not knowledge. And the most dangerous part is this: every time you choose comfort over known action, you don't just lose progress, you reinforce a version of yourself that trusts comfort more than structure. That version becomes stronger with repetition. A simple real-life scenario: someone plans to study every evening. They know exactly why consistency matters. But each evening, they delay slightly. First 10 minutes, then 30, then after dinner. Eventually, the pattern is no longer about studying, it is about avoiding starting. They still believe they are disciplined because intention exists. But identity is no longer built on intention. It is built on execution. This is why awareness alone fails. Because awareness without enforcement creates a dangerous illusion. You feel in control while repeating the same behavior. And over time, that illusion replaces accountability. Another subtle layer is emotional adaptation. The mind adjusts to inconsistency. What once felt like failure begins to feel normal. You stop reacting strongly to your own patterns. That is when change becomes hardest, because discomfort is no longer triggering correction. At that point, you don't feel lost, you feel fine. And fine is where most people stay stuck for years. So the real issue is not ignorance. It is tolerance. Tolerance for small deviations that never feel serious enough to fix, but are consistent enough to define you. If you step back and observe the full pattern, it is always the same structure. You know, you hesitate, you adjust, you justify, you repeat. That loop does not break through more knowledge. It breaks only when execution becomes non-negotiable regardless of internal state. Until then, you will continue living inside the contradiction of knowing exactly what to do and repeatedly choosing not to do it. And that contradiction, repeated long enough, becomes identity. At this stage, the issue is no longer about understanding what you should do. It becomes about whether your actions are consistent enough to shape who you are becoming. Most people stay trapped in a loop where knowledge increases, but behavior stays unstable. They accumulate clarity without building reliability. And over time, that creates a dangerous mismatch. You know more than you execute, and that gap slowly turns into frustration, not progress. Real discipline starts when you stop treating each decision as a separate event. Because when every action requires internal debate, consistency becomes impossible to sustain. You are not building structure, you are repeatedly reevaluating it. The shift is simple but uncomfortable. You stop asking whether you feel like doing what you already decided. Instead, you treat the decision as already settled. This is where compounding begins, but not in the way most people expect. It does not start with visible transformation. It starts with reduced internal conflict. Less negotiation. Less justification. Less delay. And that reduction is what slowly stabilizes identity. A person who follows through without internal debate for even a small set of actions begins to experience something different: predictability. Not external success yet, but internal consistency. And that consistency is what eventually produces results that feel inevitable rather than forced. Responsibility plays a central role here. Not emotional responsibility, but structural responsibility. Either the task was completed or it wasn't. Either the action was taken or it wasn't. The explanation afterward does not change the outcome. When you start seeing your behavior in this binary way, something shifts internally. You stop building narratives around your inconsistency and start observing it as data. And that observation removes emotional distortion. That is where correction becomes possible. Self-respect is not created through motivation. It is created through reduced contradiction between what you know and what you repeatedly do. Every aligned action strengthens that alignment. Every justified deviation weakens it. Over time, this accumulation defines your baseline identity more than any single moment of effort ever will. And once that baseline becomes stable, discipline stops feeling like something you activate. It becomes something you default to without argument. That is the real turning point most people never reach, not perfection, but stability in behavior under pressure. You already know why you're failing, and that is exactly why nothing new is required to fix it. The pattern is not hidden. It is repeated. And repetition is what turned awareness into something ineffective over time. At some point, understanding stops being valuable on its own. Because knowing the structure of your failure while continuing it only deepens the contradiction. And that contradiction is what keeps you stuck. Most people assume change requires more information, more motivation, or a better system. But in reality, it requires removing the space where negotiation happens between what you know and what you do. Because every time that negotiation appears, behavior loses. And when behavior loses often enough, identity follows it. The shift is not dramatic. It is silent. It happens the moment you stop treating your awareness as something to reflect on and start treating it as something to execute. No extra explanation changes the outcome anymore. Only consistency does. And consistency does not come from intensity, it comes from removing the option to debate what you already decided. Once that happens, you stop trying to fix yourself every day. You simply stop repeating the same permission structure that kept you stuck in the first place. At that point, nothing external changes first. You do. And everything else follows that.